The timeline controls when and for how long visual objects appear in your Flash movie. To explore this, I've opened the file called elementanimation.fla from the exercise files for this chapter. The timeline appears across the bottom of the screen and is measured in frames. You can see the frame numbering across the top of the timeline. How fast those frames are played is determined by the frames per second, or FPS. To figure out what the FPS is, open your Property Inspector if it isn't already and click on the pasteboard so we can see the document settings. We're at 24. You'll notice that this movie has content and animation over the span of 36 frames, so at 24 frames per second, it's 1.5 seconds long. Notice also the vertical red line that appears over the timeline anytime you have a movie longer than one frame. This is called the playhead, and you can drag it across the timeline to preview what your Flash movie looks like so far. Dragging the playhead is better known as scrubbing the timeline. When you scrub the timeline or click on any frame, notice at the bottom of the timeline the small number that tells you what frame the playhead is on. You can also see the frames per second and the amount of time elapsed at the point the playhead is at. My playhead is at frame 17, so 0.7 seconds have gone by at this point in the movie. So I'm going to test the movie by pressing Control-Enter on my keyboard, that's Command-Enter on the Mac, and we see the resulting SWIF. Indeed, it looks like it takes the elephant about 1.5 seconds to trumpet, and then the movie starts over. When the playhead gets to frame 36, it sees there's no more frames and starts over on frame 1. You can get a visual on what the playhead is doing while viewing the SWIF by going to the View menu and then Bandwidth Profiler. The little gray marker at the top of the screen indicates the position of the playhead, and you can see on the lower left the frames being counted out as well. I'm going to close the profiler by going to View and then clicking on Bandwidth Profiler again. I'm going to close my SWIF, and back in Flash, if we change our frames per second from 24 to 12, and then test our movie again, you'll notice that the elephant is moving twice as slowly, since 36 frames at 12 frames per second is 3 seconds. So I'll close the SWIF window and change the frames per second back to 24 in the Property Inspector. Common frame rates in Flash usually range between around 12 and 30. You can pick which frame rate works best for you, but I recommend picking a frame rate at the start of your project and then sticking to it. If you're coordinating with others about a number of Flash assets that will work together, especially if it involves video, agreeing on the frame rate ahead of time is a really good idea. You can imagine what would happen if you develop assets at 24 frames per second and someone else at 12, and then you try to combine them. Half the animations would be either way too fast or way too slow, and it would just be a big mess. So if you'd like to see more or less of the timeline at once, click on this little drop-down at the upper right of the timeline window. Choosing Tiny shrinks the views of the frames so you can see more at once. Conversely, choosing Medium makes it so you can see less frames, but each one is bigger. You can experiment with what works best for you. Choosing Short in this context menu simply shrinks the vertical space each layer takes up in the timeline. I'm going to change mine back to normal. So using the timeline and frames, you can control what items appear on your screen and when, and for how long.